Great. Hi, everybody. I hope you're all seated and settled. We're still getting people coming in. Thank you very much and welcome to join us this evening. And we took a break a bit from our series over the summer, and we're very happy to have you all back with us, and we're very excited to have the webinars once again. So today this is the seventh session of our webinar series, and once again this webinar series is brought to you by the Chinese in Africa and then Africans in China Research Network, as well as Lingnan University in Hong Kong, and also the Center for Cultural Research and Development at Lingnan University. And it's also supported by the Institute of Policy Studies at Lingnan University. Before we start, and I also introduce a speaker today, I would like to just remind everybody that we will pretty soon send out a call for paper for our upcoming conference. As our usual followers might know, we had planned in the summer of 2021, actually in 2020, to have the Africans in China, Chinese in Africa research network conference, but then because of the pandemic, we couldn't do it. So we are hoping that we can do it again next summer. So we'll put out a call for paper pretty soon. So please look out for it. And whenever it's ready, you can submit your papers for consideration for that conference. That conference will also be hosted at Lingnan University in Hong Kong. So we hope that by that time, the pandemic situation would have been much better, and then we can actually all meet face to face for this conference. So let's get on to business. So today we are lucky to have Mr. Justin Haruyama. I hope I pronounced it well. Justin is a Ph.D. candidate in cultural anthropology at University of California, Davis, and his research examines the controversial presence of Chinese migrants in Africa today, and he focuses pretty much on their social interaction between them and looking at generally how they interact in the context of their work, and then also in areas of religion, particularly in southern Zambia in a way. So today, I think one paper he's delivering to us is also situated in the context of Zambia, looking at how the language of Pidgin has been able to transform or is used as a way to define racial places or racial differences between Chinese citizens who are in Zambia or various mine sectors in Zambia, as opposed to traditional white people and others. So using this language as a way to define the different kinds of races between Chinese and then also other races from or foreigners within Zambia working landscape. So the title of the presentation, as Justin puts it, and I want to read it out exactly as he puts it so that I don't make a mistake. It's called Shortcuts English, a Pidgin language and racialization at a Chinese-operated mine in Zambia. So we are very pleased to have Justin join us. And for the next 30 to 45 minutes, he will try to share his exciting research with us. Justin, thank you very much for joining us. We are pleased to have you. And before he starts, I'd like to say that you can leave your comments and also questions in the chat room. We've opened it along the way so that as soon as he finishes, we can read some of them out. And then we will also give you opportunity to ask questions and then also raise comments or any kinds of feedback that you have for everyone, and then also to Justin as well. So Justin, once again, thank you. And you have the floor.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Patty, for that excellent introduction. And I'm very excited to get to present this material to all of you in the Chinese in Africa, Africans in Chinese network, Africans in China network. So as Patty mentioned, the title of the paper I will be presenting on today is Shortcut English, a Pidgin Language and Racialization at a Chinese operated mine in Zambia. And I look forward very much to hearing your feedback on this paper at the end of my talk. So on a bright Saturday afternoon in August 2016, I lounged with half a dozen members of the Mugoda Seventh-day Adventist Church as we took our midday break from our worship. Located in an isolated and relatively impoverished village in southern Zambia, the Mugoda SDA congregation lacked the resources to construct a church building. So instead, we held our sunrise to sunset Saturday worship services under the shade of a large acacia tree, sometimes under blistering sun and sometimes under pouring rains. On this thankfully dry afternoon, the elders and I discussed the labor problems afflicting the nearby Summers coal mine, where several of the elders were employed. Summers mine is privately owned by 5 brothers from China's Jiangxi province and features a general workforce that is recruited exclusively from the area around Mugoda, as well as a management staff that is drawn from both other parts of Zambia as well as from China. Francis, who was employed as a general miner at Summers and who was also an active leader in the local miners' union, began expressing to us how dissatisfied he was with the Chinese owners of the mine. He complained bitterly of how obstinate, in his view, the owners had been in refusing to grant any increase in miners' wages or extension of contract length during recent contract negotiations with the union. Daniel, whose senior position in the management staff at Summers both excluded him from membership in the miners' union and made his contract and salary unaffected by the contract negotiations, vociferously agreed that the owner's behavior had been inappropriate. The problem with these guys, the stakeholders, that is to say the owners, let me see. The problem with these guys, the stakeholders, that is to say the owners, is that they have money but no schooling. They aren't educated. I've worked for Swiss guys and Indian guys, and they care about safety, about wages. But these Chinese, it's like they were all farmers back in China. And then suddenly they were lifted out of the field and raised into managers. They don't even know what to do with themselves now. Francis nodded vehemently in agreement and announced that the only thing that could improve conditions for miners at Summers was for there to be a complete change in mine ownership. Several days later, as I sat visiting Daniel in his quarters at the management residential compound at Summers, I asked him how he knew that his employers from China did not have any schooling. In reply, Daniel told me, from their language, of course, the way they speak or write or even counting, they cannot count the way we count. They count in Chinese. It means they cannot reason properly. This discussion between Daniel and Francis was striking for several reasons. For one, despite their shared religious affiliation, the 2 men occupied very different positions at the mine, with Daniel a university-educated senior safety officer and Francis an ordinary miner and leader in the miners' union. The 2 men also differed in terms of ethnic and linguistic background. Francis was a Chitonga speaker who had grown up in the rural area immediately surrounding Summers mine, while Daniel was an Ichibemba speaker from the Zambian copper belt on the other side of the country. In this conversation, however, these differences were backgrounded by both men as they agreed, while speaking English with each other, that the inadequate linguistic competencies of their Chinese employers and colleagues made these Chinese fundamentally unfit to operate the mine. These comments were all the more striking since Summers Mine has experienced a history of intense labor violence between its Chinese and Zambian employees, which has at times resulted in mass shootings and underground murder. The violence at Summers has been used as fodder to feed journalistic and political narratives in both Zambia and the West of Chinese neocolonialism in Africa. And I include just sort of a selection of images of particularly sensationalist headlines in this vein. Careful analyses by Li and Salman and Yen have demonstrated that this Chinese neocolonialism thesis is misleading insofar as it singles out Chinese investment in the Zambian mining industry, which in fact is controlled by foreign corporations from many countries, not only China, and presents differences in labor regimes as a result of the different national origins of mine owners rather than the varied structural interests of different forms of capital. This work has left unanswered the question of how Asian whites from China and also India come to be perceived by Zambians as differing from whites from other countries, and why, despite commonalities across the Zambian mining industry, Violence by workers is episodically directed towards some white managers and not others. In a brief survey, Salman and Yan have suggested that racialization of Asians in Zambia may in part be due to incendiary political campaigns by the recent ruling party, the Patriotic Front. In this paper, I demonstrate a slightly different dynamic. The way in which Zambians at Summers racialize Chinese, not in terms of the political sound bites of the Patriotic Front, a party whose leaders and messages most at Summers are deeply hostile to, but rather through evaluations of the language use and proficiencies of Chinese at the mine, in particularly their use of a pidgin known locally as shortcut English. Prevalent semiotic ideologies at Summers iconically map the distinction between shortcut versus standard English onto the distinction between their stereotyped speakers, European versus Chinese whites, indexically associating evaluations of the languages with these speakers. As standard English has long been associated in Zambia with values of modernity, inclusivity, and sophistication, while shortcut English is viewed as corrupt, haphazard, and unsystematic, this has resulted in an unfavorable racialization of Chinese at Summers, though I'll actually complicate this idea of racialization at the end of this paper. It figures them as dangerously unfit to run the mine, contributing to sometimes violent hostility on the part of Zambian workers. Now, for a bit of context on the mine itself, Summers Mine, as I mentioned, is privately owned by 5 brothers from Jiangxi province, which is in Southeast China. From 2000, when it was founded, until 2015, the management staff of the mine was exclusively drawn from the owner's extended kin and affluent network in southern China, while the workforce was entirely recruited from the Zambian villages surrounding the mine itself. This early history of the mine was tumultuous, with serious mining accidents, a cholera outbreak among workers, and a series of violent labor disputes between protesting Zambian workers and the Chinese staff. In 2011, these events culminated in an incident in which Chinese staff members fired shotguns on a crowd of protesting miners, injuring 15, and a second incident 2 years later in which a group of protesting workers chased 5 members of the Chinese staff into one of the mine's underground shafts and proceeded to murder one and critically injure the other 4. These events were in part noteworthy because though Chinese expatriates in Zambia are sometimes singled out as targets of collective violence, expatriates of other nationalities who operate mines in Zambia very rarely are. In response to this violence, the Zambian government closed Summers Mine for 2 years, initially promising to find an alternative buyer, but eventually returning the mining license to the original 5 owners, under condition that they improve and regularize labor conditions at the mine. One of the requirements imposed by the Zambian government was that the mine hire a qualified staff of Zambian mine managers drawn from Zambia's established mining region on the Copper Belt to supplement the existing staff of Chinese managers and surveyors. Daniel, one of the SDA congregants described at the beginning of this essay, was just one of these newly hired, university-trained Zambian managers. Ferguson has noted that over the course of 3 decades, there's been a major shift in the Zambian mining industry from what he calls socially thick to socially thin mining capitalism. Once, mines in Zambia had been engaged in not only mineral extraction, but also long-term social investments, such as the provision of housing, schools, and hospitals to their workers, who also received relatively high wages and other material benefits. These social provisions started to be abandoned across the Zambian mining industry in the 1990s, in the same period as widespread Chinese and other foreign investment entered the country. And Yen and Saltman note that by the 2010s, Chinese mine operators had a reputation as particularly bad employers. Yen and Saltman have refuted this characterization by demonstrating the deep continuities between Chinese labor practices and those of other foreign mine operators in Zambia, while Lee has argued that what differentiates labor regimes at different enterprises across Zambia is not the national origin of the ownership, but rather the divergent interests of different kinds of capital. But by refuting the idea of distinctively Chinese labor practices in Zambia, these analyses have failed to push forward the analysis of how currents of symbolic, linguistic, and racial power that nevertheless result in Chinese being perceived as the worst employers. Looking at the role of language from my ethnographic material at Summers, I argue, is crucial to understanding these dynamics. On my first field visit to Zambia, before I had ever heard of Summers Mine, I spent a summer living with a group of men from southern China who operated a machine gambling company in the Zambian Copperbelt. The three men would franchise slot machines known as Safari to local bars and dance clubs throughout the mining townships of the Copperbelt. These slot machines were extremely popular, and each week the Chinese men I stayed with would come to collect the proceeds in huge cloth bags that would soon become stuffed with cash. While staying with the men in their house in one of the upscale suburban areas of Kitwe, the largest city on the Copperbelt, I shared bunks in a bedroom with a young man named Zhang Wei. Zhang Wei was in his early 20s, and Zambia was the first foreign country he had ever visited. As an illustration of how unused he was to seeing people who were not Chinese before he came to Zambia, Zhang Wei explained to me how, on his very first flight to Zambia on Ethiopian Airlines, he had naively been afraid to eat the food, since he was worried that the blackness of the flight attendant's hands might rub off on his food. He laughed at this and said that now he knew his worries had been ridiculous, and that now he was making a concerted effort to make friends amongst the people he met in Zambia. Soon after I began staying with Zhang Wei and his colleagues, I asked him if I could accompany him on one of his collection runs to the surrounding townships, and Zhang Wei readily agreed. We set off early that morning in a van with darkened windows, Zhang Wei and I sitting in back as Kelvin, one of the Zambian drivers employed by the company, drove in front. At the very first bar we stopped at, Kelvin and I walked into the front bar room as Zhang Wei immediately set off down a side corridor towards where the slot machines were located in the back room of the bar. As Kelvin and I walked into the front bar room, a large man whom I took to be the owner turned to us and gave us a serious, appraising look. "Mulishani, Tata," I greeted him in Ichibemba. "Good morning, sir." "Finally," the man exclaimed by way of reply. "Finally, in their wisdom, Safari decides to send us someone who can speak English. Our friends, the Chinese, can't speak a word of English. Before you, the only one I could talk to was the driver." And here he motioned towards Kelvin. "Can you believe that? The Chinese come here and all they say is ching chong, ching chong. They're like rats clogging up all our rivers." Taken aback by the vehemence of the man's comments, I quickly tried to explain that I was not, in fact, a representative of the Safari Company, but rather just an anthropology Ph.D. student who was accompanying Zhang Wei as part of my fieldwork research. The man, whom I later learned was indeed the owner of the bar, seemed displeased with my answer, but by the time Zhang Wei entered the room to confirm the proceeds that would be split between the Safari Company and the bar owner, the man was all business again. As we climbed back to the fan and Zhang Wei began recording in his notebooks the precise sums collected from each slot machine, I asked him how he felt his relations were with the people he had come to know in Zambia. Zhang Wei reiterated that he wanted to make friends in Zambia besides the two Chinese colleagues he lived with, who were both much older than him. He said he found Zambian women quite beautiful and would like to find a girlfriend to date, but communication was a difficulty. Zhang Wei was active on some WeChat forums full of Chinese speakers throughout the world who, like him, wished to improve their English, and he had a daily set of English exercises that another user on one of these forums had shared with him. I asked him if he ever considered asking a Zambian to be his conversation partner to practice his English. Zhang Wei answered negatively, firmly stating that though many Zambians knew English, the English they spoke was not Biaojun, standard. He would rather practice his English with other Chinese learners through WeChat, many of whom were located in Europe or North America and were learning to speak UK or US English. This was the English he wanted to learn, Zhang Wei said, and once he had mastered it better through the chat rooms on WeChat, he would feel more comfortable conversing with people in Zambia. Later in the conversation, Zhang Wei's colleague, Li Qiang, came to join us. Like Zhang Wei, Li Qiang was quite interested in improving his English, as he felt it would give him better job opportunities beyond Zambia. But he said he felt that the expectation that many Zambians had that he and his colleagues would be competent in English was really racist. In the following months and years of conducting ethnographic fieldwork research in Zambia, as I moved from living with the Chinese men operating the Safari Machine Gambling Company in the Zambian Copperbelt to Summers Coal Mine in southern Zambia, I found that precisely contestations such as this over the symbolic value and legitimacy of English was central to how many Zambians and Chinese articulated their relations with each other. At Summers, for example, I found that many workers complained more frequently and more vehemently about their Chinese managers' non-standard use of English than they did about other workplace conditions, such as wages, safety, or job security. The comments of Daniel, Francis, Jiangwei, Li Qiang, and the bartender, whose name I never did catch, all highlight the way that English, as both a post-colonial language in Zambia and a language of global prestige, indexes a range of values that then operate to differently evaluate various groups of people. Of course, much of this importance of English in Zambia is a result of the powerful continuing legacies of British colonialism, which many people at Summers express great ambivalence towards. English has been constitutionally mandated as Zambia's only official national language since independence, and through both the force of law and social norm, is the only language legitimately employed in government, post-primary education, daily newspapers, and the vast majority of TV and radio broadcasts, as well as international communication. A number of 20th century theorists in the late colonial and early post-colonial period were sharply critical of the ways in which formerly colonizing languages were coming to assume great prestige in the newly independent colonies. Pennycook, for example, argued that the idea of English as a global language was a deliberate construction of the British Empire, and that to speak of the language in this way reinforces colonialist dichotomies. More forcefully, scholars such as Fanon, Magubane, Philipson, and Wathingo argued that the valorization of a colonial language by colonized subjects was the result variously of collective psychosocial pathology, mental subjugation, or continuing neo-colonialist oppression. In short, a kind of colonization of consciousness. Bourdieu, too, described how the valorization of elite language forms by marginalized subjects was precisely the result of those subjects' misrecognition of the very symbolic and ideological bases of their own subjugation. Other scholars, from Achebe down to Kanagaraja, Jensen Lee, and Smith and Mwadime, have taken issue with these critiques, arguing for the ways in which colonial languages can be reappropriated by post-colonial subjects, and for the power as well as the transgressive potentials that such appropriations bring for those who practice them. Within Zambia specifically, English has been important as a unifying force in nation-building projects, and as an antidote to what Zambians refer to as tribalism, and which I, in this essay, refer to as ethnic chauvinism. Unlike languages such as Kiswahili in Tanzania and Kenya, Chichewa in Malawi, or Setswana in Botswana, which developed into national languages aided by colonial and post-colonial state policies. In Zambia, there is no single language in which more than 50% of the population is proficient. And furthermore, no language which is spoken as a first language by more than 20% of the population. Thus, the main languages in Zambia besides English, such as Ichibemba, Nyanja, Gitonga, and Lozi, tend to be highly marked by Zambians as properly belonging to specific ethnic groups or tribes. By contrast, after independence, there was almost a complete withdrawal of the European white settler population. And as a result, there is no significant ethnic community within Zambia with which English can be associated. This has resulted in a common, though not necessarily monolithic, language ideology in Zambia, which operates through a scheme of binary oppositions, in which English is figured as cosmopolitan, inclusive, and neutral, while non-English languages spoken in Zambia are regarded as ethnic, exclusive, and biased. Now to return to Summers Mine specifically. Mines and mining communities have historically played a large role in bringing people of diverse linguistic and ethnic backgrounds together in Zambia. And so it should come as no surprise that these symbolic dynamics of Zambian languages, including English that I was just describing, should be overlaid upon a quite complicated terrain of actual linguistic practice at Summers Mine. Located in a quite remote, rural part of southern Zambia, the almost exclusive language of everyday use in the communities around Summers Mine is the Valley dialect of Gitonga, which is the predominant language throughout southern province. English remains a language of great prestige and symbolic value in these communities, but proficiency in it, as well as Nyanja, which is a language that's spoken in Zambia's capital, Lusaka, tend to encompass a spectrum where younger people, men, and residents who are formally educated tend to be bilingual or even trilingual speakers, more or less proficient in English and Nyanja as well as Chitonga, while women, the elderly, and those without access to formal education tend to be monolingual Chitonga speakers. This is among Zambians. It is from these communities that the general workforce of Summers Mine, both above and underground, is overwhelmingly drawn. The mine has also brought many residents from other locales, however, not only from China, but also from other parts of Zambia. After the violence that took place at Summers in 2011 and 2013, the mine was closed for 2 years, as I mentioned, by order of the Zambian government. And part of the conditions imposed by the Zambian government for the reopening of the mine was the integration of a qualified Zambian management team to supplement the existing Chinese management staff. These Zambian managers identify with different ethnic affiliations, but all of them were recruited from the more established mining areas in the Copper Belt region in Northwest Zambia. And all are either first or second language speakers of Ichibemba, which is the main language of the Zambian Copper Belt, as well as fluent speakers of English. Most of these Zambian managers are also proficient speakers of Nyanja, which, as I said, is the main language in Zambia's capital, Lusaka. There's also a force of Zambian police officers stationed by the Zambian government at the mine to forestall future outbreaks of violence. Again, though identifying with different ethnic affiliations, these police officers were all living in Lusaka before their deployment to Summers Mine and are either first or second language speakers of Nyanja, as well as being fluent English speakers. Finally, the Chinese expatriate staff at Summers are almost all compatriots in Mandarin Laoxiang from Jiangxi province in Southeast China. And most of them speak Gan Chinese, Jiangxi Hua, amongst themselves, as well as a heavily inflected Mandarin with other Chinese speakers. There are also a few members of the Chinese expatriate staff who hail from China's Sichuan province and who exclusively speak the Sichuanese dialect of Mandarin Chinese. Notably, not a single member of the Chinese expatriate staff at the mine is able to speak any form of English, Chitonga, Ichibemba, or Nyanja. Equally, there are no Zambian employees or community members at the mine who are able to speak any variant of Chinese. This is to say there's not a single translator or interpreter at the mine. In short, though the social groupings of Chinese and Zambians at the mine are within themselves highly segmented in complex ways, the linguistic divide between these two groups, Zambians and Chinese, is a central aspect of everyday life and work at the mine, since under normal circumstances, there is not a single translator or interpreter there able to fully cross it. In this respect, my social role at the mine as an ethnographer was highly anomalous, since I was the only one who would regularly interact and converse with individuals on both sides of this linguistic divide without recourse to the shortcut English pidgin, which I will discuss in a moment. As a result, I was sometimes asked by employees of the mine to help with small tasks of translation or interpretation. Even then, however, my ability to function as a translator was highly imperfect, since my knowledge of Chitonga and especially Gan Chinese is limited to non-existent in the case of Gan Chinese. Despite this rather conspicuous lack of a fully shared language, Zambian and Chinese individuals at Summers do work together and play together, joke together, and have long-term romantic and sexual relations together, partnerships sometimes that last the better part of a decade, on an everyday basis. In the highly patriarchal and racialized social organization of work at the mine, teams of Zambian male miners sent underground are always led by a male Chinese shift boss, while in the kitchen of the management living compound, a Chinese madame leads a group of Zambian women in preparing 3 meals a day for the Chinese management staff. Madame is a word within the shortcut English pidgin. As indicated above, even though many of the Chinese and Zambian employees at Summers have been working at the mine continuously since it first began operations in 2000, over the almost 2 decades since then, now more than 2 decades, not a single Chinese staff member has gained proficiency in a language spoken by the Zambian community or vice versa, an indication of just how sharp the prevailing social divisions are at the mine, a point I will return to in a moment. Nevertheless, in the course of their everyday labor and other, including romantic and friendship interactions, the different language communities at Summers have been involved in the creation or replication of something new. namely a Pidgin language that in its broad outlines resembles the Pidgin spoken between Zambian and Chinese individuals throughout Zambia, and is known locally to residents and workers at Summers Mine as shortcut English, which comes from the idea of taking a shortcut to communicate one's meaning. The Pidgin draws its vocabulary almost exclusively from Zambian English, though the pronunciation of these vocabulary items can vary considerably from standard Zambian English. It also includes a smattering of Chitonga, Ichibemba, and Nyanja vocabulary items as well. There are some lexical items in the Pidgin that are of unclear provenance, but none that I was able to clearly identify as originating from any variety of Chinese. Though, as I mentioned, I have proficiency in Mandarin, but not in Gan Chinese, so I don't have any expertise to evaluate Gan Chinese. Nevertheless, the language does strongly exhibit some apparent grammatical influences from one or more varieties of Chinese. For example, in the absence of any lexical question markers, such as the Chitonga Sena or Henna, or the Mandarin Ma, the basic way to grammatically form a question in shortcut English is through a verb-no-verb structure, a structure which is almost completely absent in Chitonga or English, but is extremely typical of Chinese languages. So for example, if you wanted to ask in shortcut English, do you understand? You would say, understand, no understand, which is analogous to Mandarin dong bu dong. Or if you wanted to ask, will you go? You would say, you go, no go, which is analogous to Mandarin ni chu bu chu. Or if you want to ask if something's okay, if something's all right, you would say good and no good, which is analogous to Mandarin hao bu hao. Now, giving some background on Pidgins and Creoles for a moment, which are collectively known as contact languages. Historically, these languages have developed under conditions of severe power disparities between different speech communities, most famously under plantation slavery and colonialism. Indeed, these power disparities seem to be a necessary component for Pidginization and Creolization to occur at all, since very powerful social forces are needed to overcome more usual processes of language transmission. To account for these disparities, Creolists have conventionally classified the source languages that contribute to an emerging Pidgin as either substrate or superstrate, where substrate refers to the source languages spoken by those with comparatively less power, and superstrate to the source language spoken by those with more. The standard view is that contact languages are lexified by, which is to say they derive their vocabulary from, the superstrate, while deriving some or all of their grammar and structural features from the substrate. Here I just have a couple pictures of the work teams at Summers Mine, both male going underground and female working in the kitchen. Sitting under a tree by mine shaft number 7 of Summers Mine, I shared lunch with 2 of the local Chitonga-speaking women who were employed by the mine as cooks and housekeepers for its Chinese staff, Kayla and Alice. As we sat on the ground chatting, Kayla and Alice laughed at the sight of Wang Fong, their Chinese madame or supervisor, scribbling furiously in her notebook as she tried to write down the words being spoken to her by one of the Zambian miners. Look at Madame, she's so cute. She can't speak, but she wants to learn, Kayla laughed. She wants to learn English, but she is only learning shortcut English. That's all. The interaction between Wang Fong, Kayla, and Alice, though apparently humorous and lighthearted, suggests a quite different kind of symbolic dynamic at play than that which took place in the classic examples of language contact just described. On the one hand, in terms of control over economic capital and formal authority at the mine, the Chinese expatriates certainly seem to be the dominant actors. Wang Fong is the boss of Kayla and Alice, after all, and she has the informally authorized, informally practiced authority to fire or even to physically beat the employees who follow directly under her supervision at Summers Mine. Like other Chinese supervisors at the mine, Wang Fong also earns 5 to 6 times as much money as do Zambian employees, even when performing basically similar kinds of work. In these respects, the position of Wang Fong and other Chinese supervisors at Summers is not so different from that of expatriates from other relatively wealthier countries working in Zambia. But if the economic structure of Summers' mind places Wang Fong and other Chinese expatriate staff in a position of authority, the symbolic dynamics present at the mine tend in a very different direction. It is not Kayla and Alice that are targeting their language on Wang Fong's, but rather Wang Fong that is targeting her language on theirs. And boss or no, Kayla and Alice are extremely mocking of her efforts to do so. Fanon once described how a colonial master might use Pidgin to address a Black colonial subject as he would a child, by smirking, whispering, patronizing, and cozening. But overwhelmingly at Summers, it is structurally less powerful Zambians who use shortcut English to patronize, cozen, and smirk to their Chinese bosses. This suggests that language at Summers, and the shortcut English specifically, constitute a symbolically countervailing force to Chinese economic and political dominance at the mine. In the terminology of sociolinguistics, despite the seemingly authoritative position Chinese actors enjoy at Summers' mine, linguistically speaking, their language variety or code, namely Chinese, operates as a subordinated substrate rather than a dominating superstrate. The way that Chinese expatriates are figured in these sociolinguistic and language ideology dynamics is, in some senses, analogous to processes of racialization as understood in the West, processes that Satman and Yen argue have taken place with regards to Chinese throughout Africa. But despite similarities, categorization of Chinese by Zambians at Summers is more complicated than can be simply reduced to the Western notion of race. So historically, the hallmarks of racial thinking in the West for the last several centuries have been that this kind of race thinking understands differences between human beings as biologically grounded, and that it categorizes these differences in terms of outward phenotypical appearance, most prominently skin color. Zambians at Summers almost always differentiate people along the lines of skin color in much this same way. And they categorize people as either in Chitonga Bantu Vasia, which is cognate to Ichibemba Abantu Abafita, and is glossed in Zambia English as blacks, on one hand, or on the other hand, in Chitonga as Vamakuwa, which is cognate to Ichibemba Avasungu, and glossed in Zambian English as whites. But unlike typical US and European racial imaginaries, in which racial groups function, in theory at least, as rigid categories, and into which an individual's membership or non-membership is completely static, Zambian categorizations of people operate as more of a sliding scale and fluctuate greatly based on context. For example, Zambians at Summers would often say, "Bachainizi imbagua, hele bachainizi tavali bagua inchoveni," which is, in English, the Chinese are white, but they are not real or true whites. Thus, at one end of the scale of this category, for example, Vamakuwa whites, there are people whose membership is undisputed and applies in any social context. This includes people from England or the USA who are marked phenotypically in sort of these ideologies at Summers' mind, marked phenotypically by their long noses. Other kinds of people, such as Germans, who operate a development NGO a couple hours walk from Summers' mine, and Chinese are more ambiguous. Depending on social context, Zambians will shift frequently between referring to these people as Vamakuwa or whites, or as belonging to some other differentiated subcategory. Unlike in Euro-American racial ideologies, Zambians at Summers do not articulate any additional supercategories or color terms, such as in Euro-American racial ideologies, such as an Asian, quote unquote, yellow race, for example, into which to group these ambiguous subjects, such as Germans and Chinese. Instead, they treat Germans and Chinese as just other tribes of Vamakuwa whites, who nevertheless are not Vamakuwa Inchoveni, or real whites. This distinction between Vamakuwa whites and Vamakuwa Inchoveni, or real whites, is in some sense an example of racial-linguistic racialization, insofar as it explicitly evaluates subjects in a triangulating discourse. And here I nod to the work of Roberto and Jamie Monson, against norms of both real whiteness as well as real blackness. But this distinction is not based on skin color, since Zambians see the skin of white people from China, Germany, or the USA, as well as other foreigners with which they're familiar, such as Indians, Lebanese, and Peruvians, as equally white in appearance. In theory, the distinction between bamakuwa whites and bamakuwa inchoveni, real whites, is based on phenotypical appearance to an extent, with the aforementioned long nose the most frequently cited way to differentiate between whites and real whites. So real whites should have a long nose, and someone who's lacking a long nose is not a real white in this discourse. In practice, however, whether ambiguous subjects such as German or Chinese foreigners would be classified as whites or not in any given context was almost always based on language use and social practice. In a conversational context where their role as owners and operators of a mine who hail from a non-African country is being foregrounded, for example, Chinese are universally recognized at Summers as bamakuwa, or whites. But in reference to their use of Chinese and shortcut English rather than any variety of standard English, Zambians downplay or even outright deny Chinese whiteness, marking them as a highly differentiated subcategory referred to as bachainizi. Moreover, as in racist ideologies originating in the West that long saw external physical features such as skin tone as highly or even invariably correlated with inner traits of personality and intelligence, Zambians at Summers similarly tend to view language production as an outward manifestation of inner character. This racialization, or pseudo-racialization, what I'm arguing is it doesn't perfectly map onto Western ideas of racialization, through language is not, on the whole, flattering to Chinese. Though Machainizi are recognized for their diligence and hard work ethic among Zambians at Summers, they are also highly stereotyped in ways related to their language use, as heartless or even soulless, mean-spirited, cheap, dishonest, and corrupting. This fuels Zambian resentments of Chinese ownership and operation of Summers, contributing to the violence that has at times broken out between Zambian and Chinese employees. Chinese owners and managers of Summers are thus figured as not real whites through a set of sociolinguistic dynamics that are themselves the result of complex post-colonial legacies. As in the situation described by Woolard in late Franco Catalonia, in which the positive values indexed by Catalonian serve to undermine the authority of a dominant Castilian language political and legal regime, the continuing symbolic power of English in Zambia works to undermine the otherwise dominant authority of Chinese managers within the confines of Summers' mine. But it also does more than that. Because the Chinese expatriates can only communicate with their employees and other community members in shortcut English, which sounds to many at Summers like just a broken, bastardized form of standard English, the use of this linguistic code also differentiates its Chinese speakers from other foreign operators of Zambian mines, both in the past and the present, figuring these Chinese operators unflatteringly as a subcategory of whites less deserving of authority at the mine. Thus, in a period of deep neoliberalization of the Zambian economy, in which Zambia's mining sector, its flagship industry, is under almost the complete control of foreigners, as was the case in the colonial period, race and language have once again become central elements by which the labor relations of extraction are organized and resisted at Summers' mine. Standard English, long used as part of a colonial apparatus to marginalize and exclude Zambians, is now being repurposed by Zambians at Summers at a symbolic and semiotic, and therefore practical level, to contest the legitimacy of the Chinese owners of the means of production. As global geopolitical power structures continue to shift, and China, and to a lesser extent India, become new economic superpowers, these sociolinguistic processes and the othering processes they imply, which, as I've argued, are analogous to but not completely identical with Western practices of racialization, may well shift there may well come a time in not so many years that Chinese languages, such as Mandarin, seriously compete in the marketplaces of symbolic capital in Anglophone post-colonial societies such as Zambia. But at Summers' mind, at least, that time is still a far way off. There, the semiotic potentials of standard as well as shortcut English, as well as the different forms of whiteness they index, continue to motivate Zambians to engage in sometimes violent resistance against labor conditions they find extremely undesirable. And with that, I will conclude my talk, and I look forward to feedback.
Thank you very much, Justin. Thank you. Yes, I think time is right. We still have some minutes or some time for Q&A. So I wouldn't want to disrupt the flow. We have been having some nice conversation going on in the chat room since your presentation started. I believe you also have access to the chat room. So I'm actually starting from the top in a way. I think Shmuel, you started with a question, what I believe to be more of a comment. If you are available and also in a place to talk, you can actually unmute yourself and directly ask the question. But whilst I wait on you, I'll rather go ahead and then also try to read it myself. Shmuel is asking that Chinese in Zambia, and not those in mining alone, for conversation and cooperation with domestic population of Zambians, more using English, something like that. They are more using English, and Chinese, in the case of those of any groups of Zambians, are trying to also learn Chinese or trying to learn domestic national languages of the domestic folks of Zambia, something like that. So I think it's more of a comment. I don't know if Justin, you have any feedback on this about each side trying to learn the language of the other to facilitate some sort of, coexistence in a way. Did you find something similar? I think you highlighted that a bit.
Yeah. To situate Summers within Zambia more generally. So Summers is a bit of an extreme case in that there are no translators and no interpreters. So communication can only operate at the level of the shortcut English pidgin. There are many, many other Chinese operated businesses in Zambia right now. And it would be more typical amongst those businesses for there to be a few translators and interpreters, usually Chinese who are proficient in English, standard English. And then a larger Chinese staff who usually are not terribly proficient in standard English, and so may end up in their everyday lives using pidgins like shortcut English. Yeah. So in that sense, the linguistic divide is not so severe, not quite so extreme as most other Chinese businesses in Zambia, but in its broad continuities is similar, because usually there's only a minority of English proficient Chinese employees, excepting maybe like Bank of China, some relatively high level institutions in Lusaka. And then in terms of Zambians learning Chinese, still quite rare, though growing slowly. So there is a Confucius Institute at the University of Zambia where some students are learning it. Another chapter of my dissertation is on Jehovah's Witnesses, Zambian Jehovah's Witnesses who become fluent in Mandarin Chinese in order to evangelize and proselytize to Chinese migrants. But accepting sort of those Jehovah's Witnesses and students at Confucius Institute, it's very rare for any Zambians to learn Chinese.
Okay, thank you very much. And yeah, before I go, I also have something that crossed my mind, but I think you highlighted that a bit, especially when you made issues of colonialism and then those sort of imperialistic approaches in terms of language dominance globally. But I was curious a bit about why, for example, the Zambians wouldn't be more expectant or anxious for the Chinese to learn the local languages instead of English, speak proper for the Chinese, or expect the Chinese to speak proper English instead of their actual local languages, because I don't think that is probably much better for communication in a way on everyday level, especially. But then why would they expect them to speak English? Of course, aside from maybe official or business aspect of it, because I felt that in your presentation, the Zambians, or at least, or even the Chinese as well, were looking for more like contact, social contact on a level aside from the work or the job that they were doing in the mine sector. They wanted something aside from that so that they can be more interactive on a social level in a way. So why wouldn't they then expect them to learn the local language rather than English, which is, of course, is an official language, but still foreign language?
Yeah, so there's certainly a broad variety of interactions between Chinese and Zambians at Summers Mine. And some, as you suggest, are certainly outside of the labor relation. As I said, I mean, there are some like long-term romantic relationships between Chinese women, Chinese men and Zambian women. But I mean, the primary way, probably the bulk of linguistic encounters between Chinese and Zambians happens mostly around the labor encounter at the mine. And I mean, certainly, so, again, it's sort of addressing sort of the post-colonial power of English in Zambia. So at that sort of level, at the high level of business and at the level of university trained staff, which in Zambia, Zambians say that, mine managers should be university trained. In Zambia, there's an expectation that that sort of like highly sort of prestigious talk happen in English. So in that sense, I mean, even if the Zambian or the Chinese staff were able to speak like Chitonga, for example, I think they would still not seem very appropriate as mine managers, because as mine managers, they should speak this sort of prestige language in Zambia, which is English. But certainly, as you suggest, in terms of like, more like friendships and romantic encounters and stuff like that, I think Zambians would be more interested in the Chinese learning, for example, Chitonga, and some do. Some learn sort of a very sort of basic form of Chitonga in order to, for example, flirt or pursue romantic relationships with Zambian women.
Thank you very much. I think there's certainly some other examples from other contexts, aside from your study area as well, that probably some other people or other colleagues here can also share. I'll go back to the chat room. I see a question also from Xiaojian. Your question is more about asking about, the lexical, the grammatical aspect of the pidgin and others. I'm not sure if just saying can comment on that, but I actually also see that someone, is it Tal Pascal? Tal Pascal has also responded. If for colleagues joining us, you can also look at the chat room to see the interesting conversations going on. Ta is making a comment and giving some examples of some of those pidgin, and I believe also, Justin, you mentioned you gave some several examples of how they use the pidgin in this context and in back translation. So I think more or less you answered this question. I believe Xiaojian put in this question before you got to that point of representation, so probably we may not need to go there unless, Xiaojian, you have any follow-up to that. J1 also asks, did the Zambian workers that you encountered in the field mention in detail or in passing Korean, Japanese, or Taiwanese presence? I think someone's trying to know more about some sort of diversity aside from Chinese. How do they also look at those other Asian people from Asian origin in a way?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Jaewon. I never heard them talk about Taiwanese, but certainly they did mention on occasion Koreans and Japanese. There are, for example, some Japanese, what's the volunteer program? I forget the acronym, but there's a Japanese volunteer program. And so there are some, Japanese volunteers around Zambia, but in general, certainly at the area around Summers Mine, Korean and Japanese are quite rare. So, they would mention, like, if I asked Zambians, like, okay, who all counts as bamakuwa and who doesn't count as bamakuwa? They would certainly mention Koreans and Japanese as falling under bamakuwa, though not necessarily the bamakuwa Enshaveni, the real whites, but falling under whites. But they otherwise, I think they didn't have a lot to say about Koreans or Japanese. Just most people at Summer's Mind had very little experience meeting or conversing or interacting with Koreans or Japanese. And I didn't hear them mention Taiwanese. I'm not actually familiar with any Taiwanese businesses in Zambia, though of course there are in surrounding countries.
Great, thank you, Jackson. So Clifford is putting something interesting here about, again, going back to the language and considering English as a medium of communication within the spheres. And he also shares some of his experience. Justin, if you can also go there whilst I try to read along. Clifford says that if we have Zambians considering Chinese as uneducated because they do not speak proper English, and this, like I said, he has also heard this in other places. So if we see these Chinese Zambians seeing the Chinese as uneducated because they don't speak proper English, and then we also have the Chinese holding the viewpoints that the Africans do not speak proper English, then he's asking that, do we have in the background two ethnographic, linguistic, post-colonial viewpoints? It is, in a sense. I think, yeah, Clifford also, more or less, you have some sort of answers to it. I don't know if Clifford is here to even elaborate or share some of his experience, but Justin, if you have any comment to that, that'd be nice.
Yeah, I think so. One thing I want to sort of point to in this paper, and maybe I could spell it out more explicitly, is so, you know, as I mentioned in the paper, historically, Pidgins and Creoles tended to have a superstrate and a substrate of the more powerful speakers and the less powerful speakers, right? But in this current period, you know, since 2000, which is when Chinese bought Summer's Mind and started developing it, in this current period, I mean, there's also global dynamics to consider. And one global dynamic is English as like a global superstrate. So in a sense, it doesn't matter that Chinese are the dominant actors at Summer's Mind particularly, because that's just sort of a small eddy, a small countercurrent within sort of the global power of English as a superstrate, which Zambians are very aware of. And then furthermore, as your question points to, I mean, within English, certain dialects of English operate as certain global superstrates, which is what I wanted to sort of point to in the paper. So that American and British English, maybe to a little lesser extent, you know, Australian or Canadian English, that these are the superstratal, the prestige dialects of English. And, you know, any other forms of English, such as Pidgin shortcut English spoken by Chinese at Summers, or Zambian English, even though some Zambians are English as their first language, that these are then sort of denigrated as lower class versions of English. And so that, you know, these sort of global and also Zambia specific linguistic hierarchies then come to really sort of shape and endanger the position of individual Chinese who are working in Zambia.
Okay, thank you very much, Justin. So we have a lot of comments coming in. So I'm just going through it. Whilst I try to go through it, Roberto is asking, because you were describing, making references to different kinds of, let's call them whites, different kinds of whites. So where would you place yourself, Justin, during your fieldwork? Because positionality as a researcher, and especially within the topic that you were following or trying to investigating, was very crucial in there. So how did you position yourself? So this is some empirical and also practical issues critical to your work.
Yeah, thank you for that, Roberto. And of course, as you point out, a super important question. So I categorize myself, or I self-identify as multiracial, as both white and Japanese. But at Summers, I was definitely, people would refer to me not as only as Vamakuwa white, but as Vamakuwa Inchoveni, as a real white. I guess because I have a pretty pale complexion and I come from the United States, and they told me I had a really long nose. And that was really the clinching factor for them. I never thought of myself as having a long nose before going there, but for those reasons, definitely Zambians talked about me and described me, at least to my face when they were talking to me, as a vamakuwa or mukuwa introveni, as a real white or an American white.
Okay, thank you very much. So whilst you're reading that, Yoon says hi to everybody. Yoon Jun Park is here. She says hi to everybody. And someone from Zambia is joining us, and she also she's contesting one of the terminologies. Maybe you can probably explain. Miss Monimala Sigen Puter, I hope I pronounced your name well. She's saying that a term like bachainizi or bachainizi is not derogatory. It is merely used as a descriptive noun, like Mwenye, meaning Indian in Zambian context in a way. So I think this actually ties in with an earlier question that, let me try to get it right. I think it's Chenwen mentioned about, the changing meaning of some of these terminologies across time and then space in a way. So how do you respond to these? Do you have any comment to them?
Yeah, so thank you for that point, Monimala. And yes, you're absolutely right. I did not intend to suggest that the word machainizi or vachainizi, I don't mean to suggest that that word is itself derogatory. It's not a slur. It is just, I mean, the word that people use in Chitonga to describe Chinese people. And in that sense, the word itself is sort of neutral. Rather, I meant to suggest that even though the word itself is neutral, but when in context, in conversational context, in my experience, in Summer's mind, when Zambians refer to the Chinese as Machainizi and not as Vamakuwa, they are usually drawing an unfavorable comparison. So if they are speaking positively about Chinese, for example, or speaking more about sort of their legitimacy, their authority, their legitimate authority, let's say, they would be more likely to describe them as Vamakuwa, as whites. Whereas if they're criticizing the Chinese for their language use and stuff, they would be more likely to describe them as Machainizi, which is not to say that Machainizi, the word itself, is an insult, but that sort of conceptual categorization tended to be more negative in my experience at Summers, which is what I'm trying to describe in this paper.
Okay, thank you very much. We're doing about 10 minutes more in a way, so we can quickly run through this. Miss, I think Mono is, I think Mono, I don't think Justin seeks to say that his conclusions or his findings are actually representative of the whole of Zambia. He never said that, so I think we can clear that out of the way in a way. I want to go back to a question that's, I think, when Shu mentioned that, could you elaborate a bit more on your closing argument? I think if she understood well that English is repurposed to contest the Chinese ownership of means of production in this mining contest. So is there something like that? Perhaps you can reiterate what you meant by that in a way.
Right. And I'm sorry, can you just tell me again, whose question are we looking at?
Wen Shu. Yes.
Okay.
She said that, could you elaborate on your closing argument that English is repurposed to contest the Chinese ownership of the means of production in this mining contest?
Yeah, so what I guess what I'm trying to do in this paper is to draw a line of connection between sort of the representational or the ideational, the discursive on the one hand, and then sort of the pragmatic and the practical and the physical on the other hand. And so what I'm trying to argue or suggest in that concluding section is that the way that Chinese become figured at Summers' mind and the way that shortcut English is viewed and especially viewed in relation to standard English, and therefore the way that Chinese are viewed in relation to Vamakuwa and Toveni, to real whites, that this sort of fuels Zambian resistance to labor conditions at the mine, which they really don't like, which they find extremely undesirable. And so, as I mentioned, and maybe I gloss over this a bit too briefly, but overall in my research at Summers, even though Zambians complained a lot about labor conditions at the mine, they complained much more about the linguistic usage of the Chinese managers, and that the Chinese managers only spoke shortcut English. And so the fact that Summers has been, racked in past years by these really severe labor conflicts, which actually have over the years been beneficial for workers. They got the Zambian government to turn attention to the mine and start regularizing the mine and start improving conditions for workers. It's actually led to a very large increase in worker welfare. So I'm trying to suggest in this paper that is related to their perception of Chinese language use, and that the sort of Chinese language use in terms of shortcut English, and then the way that they get figured through that becomes sort of like a pole around which Zambians at the mine articulate their labor grievances.
Thank you very much, Justin. So we take maybe two more and then we end this session. Going to the message from Opoku Ajiman. He's saying, he would like to know how has the emergence of this Pidgin language affected people-to-people engagements, maybe some general observation among the native and then the Chinese. And a follow-up is, how is the Creole language emerging vis-a-vis the Pidgin?
Yes, so I think, so it's too early, I think, to refer to shortcut English as a Creole. So often amongst Creolists, the distinction that is made between a Pidgin and a Creole is a Creole is when a generation of children are sort of born into the language and start taking up the language as their first language. And it's at that point that the Pidgin starts sort of getting more fleshed out and becomes a complete language on its own. And so there are some children that are being born right now from Chinese fathers and Zambian mothers, but still right now, the Chinese in this part of southern Zambia around Summers Mine are pretty transitory. They might stay for a decade or even 12 years, but then they go back to China. And if they have children in Zambia, they tend to leave those children and maybe just send money from time to time to the mothers. And so as a result, those children are still being brought up in Zambian languages, in Chitonga or in English or Nyanja. And so I don't think, no children are really being born into this language, shortcut English, yet. That might happen in the future, but it's not happening yet. So right now it's definitely still just a Pidgin. Yeah, I mean, so shortcut English more broadly, like how does it relate to people-to-people engagements? Yeah. I guess, I mean, it's a language that was created from scratch in order to enable these engagements. So in a context in which, the mine owners were not willing to spend the money to hire a translator or an interpreter. So this is a language that is built up through everyday interactions, and it's built up through labor relations, which are often tense, but not only labor relations. And in my sort of longer version of this paper, I talk about some of the ways that it's used as a joking language, as a language of flirtation, as it has these other purposes that, because at Summers Mine, the Zambians and Chinese, they live together. It's a very remote community. It's small population. So these people interact with each other on a really everyday basis.
Yes, and just adding to that, I think Clifford made some submission to what Opoku Jiman mentioned, that while the Creoles and Pidgins are contact languages, as they are not the same, because the Creoles typically arise in isolation, but that is in Mauritian and then Seychelles and Cape Verdean Creole. So it's also support what you just argued in a way. So let's see if we have any other question that we could, or comment we could attend to. Yes, I think, yeah, we are good for now. Justin, do you have any final words?
Yes, I guess just to say thank you. I can see that there are a lot of still comments and questions on the chat box I have not had a chance to respond to. I hope somehow, perhaps if I could even just get a copy of the chat file after this is done, I would love to review all the excellent comments and feedback that I see here on this chat box. And I'm very grateful for all of you for listening to this piece and giving your feedback. It was a pleasure to get to share this with you, and I hope to continue conversations with many of you in the future.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Justin, for a wonderful presentation and sharing your research with us. And as Roberto has also mentioned in the chat room, just a gentle reminder that we're going to have another symposium very soon. We're going to announce the date and time. And as usual, we will send out the advertisement and then the invitation, so you can always register. And before we go, we also like to, again, like I started by saying, we are preparing for the invitation of proposals for our upcoming conference, the one we postponed. That is the Chinese in Africa and Africans in Chinese Research Network Conference, hopefully in 2022. So we are going to send out the invitations. So please prepare your proposals, and once it's ready, you can submit. Last time when we did, we had over 60 submissions, which was meant to be a very fantastic conference, but due to COVID, we couldn't do it. But hopefully, we can do that next summer in a way. So thank you once again. And this, again, to remind you, this webinar has been brought to you by Lingnan University, and then also the Center for Cultural Research and Development at Lingnan University, the Institute of Public Studies, Policy Studies at Lingnan University, and then, of course, the Chinese in Africa and Africans in Chinese Research Network, which is the bigger umbrella here for us to bring you this wonderful webinar today. So once again, thank you all very much for participating, and thank you, Justin. Thank you, Roberto, and our colleague, Holly, you don't see her, but she's behind the scenes helping with everything. Thank you all. Have a good night if you are around this area, and wherever you are, enjoy your time. Bye-bye.